All right, I think it's 12:30 and we can start our session. Well, hello and welcome to everyone to the last panel for Huddle 2021, Global Communications in the Time of COVID-19 and the Priorities Post-Pandemic. I'm Mandira Banerjee, Global Communications Officer at the University of Virginia. And I just wanted to respond to Carla Katter's panel yesterday, which she talked about doing communications through central office and schools and colleges. And I'll say that I've been lucky to do global communications in both those roles and have learned so much in the last decade. I did global communications through Central Communications Office at University of Michigan for 13 years. And I moved to University of Virginia in early 2020 to be the first Global Communications Officer at the University of Virginia, associated with the Office of the Vice Provost for Global Affairs, Ambassador Steve Mao. And that was a few weeks before the pandemic started. So in the last year and a half, I feel like the umbrella of global communications, or what comes under global communications, has changed so much, from stories about bringing students back safely from study abroad, communicating with our international students as they navigated the pandemic, disseminating news and faculty research in global contexts, and so on. And we'll talk about all of it in our panel discussion today. We have some great people who will be sharing their insights. So for our panel, we brought together 3 leaders from different institutions, and let me do brief introductions and maybe go to each one of them for opening comments, and we can jump right into our conversation. So I want to start with Laura Brinn, who joined Duke University's Public Affairs and Government Relations staff in 2010 and leads international communications, social media, and other external communication engagements for the university. And she was the core member of the team that supported the creation of Duke Kunshan University in Kunshan, China in 2014. Laura previously served in media relations and marketing roles in Duke's Fuqua School of Business and Duke's University Health System. And before joining in 2001, Duke, she was account executive in Adobe Public Relations Worldwide in New York City. And Laura has an MBA and a master's degree from Duke and holds undergraduate degrees in communications and German. Over to you, Laura.
Sure. Thank you, Mandira, and thank you to everyone with the Huddle for having us here today. It's great to be here. I'll just add, not in my bio related to the undergraduate degree in German, I had the opportunity to spend a year of my college experience at the University of Mannheim in Germany. And I think having that experience of having been an international student and then working in international education has really been a guiding force for me in my career. There's a small network of us who do global communications and work on global topics at universities. And I'm delighted to learn from everyone here today. And I hope that we'll have the opportunity to perhaps expand that network from others who are here in the Huddle today. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. And over to our next panelist, Karin Fischer. She is a longtime higher education journalist with a focus on higher education, including American colleges activities overseas, the globalization of college experience, and the study abroad. And if you have not signed up for her newsletter Latitude right now, I recommend that you do it right away. It's a weekly newsletter and really a terrific one, especially through the pandemic, to hear about all the different issues that everybody has been talking about. And she reported in the international student recruitment and experience of foreign students in the US, and it has been collected in Chinese Journey, Student Migrations, Family Dreams, and What Happens Next. And her work has also appeared in New York Times, EdSource, Washington Monthly, and University World News. In addition, Karin is also a research associate at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at the University of California at Berkeley, and International Education Leadership Fellow at the University of Albany. She is a recipient of East West Center's Jefferson Program for reporting in Asia, and the International Reporting Fellowship. And her work has been honored by the Education Writers Association, the National Foundation, and Pioneer Institute. So over to you, Karin.
Well, thanks, Mandira. I'm happy to be here with all of you today. I know many of you because this is my beat and I talk with you a lot, but I'm also interested and been particularly since the pandemic thinking about not just the ways that you all communicate with reporters like me, but also with students and families and these broader constituencies. And so I'm really excited for the conversation. So thank you for including me.
Thank you. We're glad to have you. And our third panelist is Rebecca Valli. She is Director of Media Relations at Cornell University. And while at Cornell, she developed university's international media strategy to amplify the work that Cornell does in research and leadership, and also specializes in international research and outreach, and also connections in New York City. She is a native of Italy and spent most of her 20s in China working as a journalist and learning Mandarin and reporting for Voice of America from Beijing and Hong Kong. And she is a graduate of University of Milan and earned a master's degree in journalism from University of Hong Kong. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Mandira, and the other panelists for the generosity and the opportunity. So I'm sure we'll get into all of this as the panel goes on, but I think that partly for me, I grew up in Italy. I spent a long time outside of the US. I came to the US and to higher ed without really having had the experience, the college experience here. And it's been home for me is kind of an interesting concept. And I think that if we look around where I am living currently in Ithaca, that's really the experience of a lot of students here and a lot of staff and a lot of faculty. And so thinking about global communication, and in my case, also media outreach, it's ever more important. So I'm looking forward to a good conversation.
So to get things going, I wanted to start this with a broad question around global communications to set the stage and ask maybe each one of you to talk a little briefly about, why is global communication still so relevant for higher education institutions, and what kind of a role it has played in each of your work in the last couple of years.
Sure. So I can jump in. I would say, so I've been doing global communications at Duke for about 10 years now, and it's definitely evolved. So when we really started doing global communications in a kind of defined way, it was global reputation building for the institution, helping Duke to be better known around the world by students and parents and others. And also building capabilities and capacity, within our university of helping people know how to operate globally and do communications globally. And I think, and we'll probably get to this more, certainly in part because of the pandemic, but also other forces over time, it's become even more important communicating with our own global audiences in new and different ways and connecting with them, and using what we have learned in some ways for external audiences to bring that back home and be more intentional about how we communicate with our own constituents.
Brinn or Rebecca?
I mean, I would go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, okay, it's okay. I think that maybe it's useful, it would be useful a little bit for me to frame where we were sort of before the pandemic, where, about 5 years ago, we started being a little bit more sort of conscious of what we were doing. And I'm going to talk more in the media space to promote the university and research to outlets outside of the US. And that was a daunting task because media relations oftentimes needs a level of specialization and prioritization. And when you're looking at the world, that was daunting. And so we created, and 5-6 years ago, a roadmap of sort of a strategy that would help us in that space. It started with geographical areas, just defining geographical areas that really where we had both sort of research strengths, but also institutional footprints. We also did what we do with media relations within the US. So looked at outlets, looked at their audiences, and identified the ones that we thought were strategic in those countries. And then we sort of went to contacts, how do you develop contacts with outlets that are far away? You are not consuming perhaps their production on a day-to-day basis. And we started, looking at foreign correspondents that were in the US from these outlets. So that was sort of part of the strategy. The other big part had to do with trips and making sure that we took advantage of all of the travel that was happening with researchers and with leadership. So that was sort of our strategy in kind of a couple of minutes. The first part, I think this last 2 years was still very much important, and we've focused on that and continue to. The second part, taking advantage of the fact that our faculty was traveling to pitch them to reporters in the area, just became nothing, because of the pandemic, and so we had to definitely pivot and think of other ways.
I so agree. I would say that when in the last 10 years, global communications has evolved so much, and more so in the last year and a half, from doing external, at least in the way that I've seen, and that, as I said in the early part of, as I was introducing, from media relations, which was a big part of global communications and at universities to start including what else, like talking about study abroad, helping students come back, reaching out about supporting international students, definitely has, evolved into all of those things under the big, larger umbrella, I would say, of global communications. What do you think, Karin? How has your reporting evolved, especially in the last couple of years?
I mean, I think there's the last couple of years and then there's COVID, right? I guess I would say, I come at this from a couple of different perspectives. Certainly I'm coming at it as a reporter and observing just simply how the way that I communicate with the people who are responsible for universities' global strategies has changed over the years. And, I've been doing it for more than a dozen years. And there were not very many people who were tasked with doing global strategy, whether in the global affairs office or the international studies office or whatever your particular institution calls it, nor were there people who were, in more centralized positions who necessarily had global education as part of their remit. If they were, it was often, let me pitch you on the study abroad story. It wasn't the kind of more sophisticated outreach that you're talking, that you've all been talking about. And I think just for many colleges, it's become really critical piece of this, because you are both thinking about these vast audiences, as Laura pointed out, all around the world. I mean, as the numbers of international students in the United States have gone past the 1 million mark, that's so many students and alumni and family to talk with. It's also the case that the research is very global, and I think COVID has certainly emphasized that, and so those kinds of messages matter as well. And I also you read my way too long bio, but one of the things I do is at the University of Albany teach a class on communications, and with a very specific international focus. And I would say in my last class, I did have people at very large universities who were there, but most of my students were at small institutions. They were sometimes the people who are running 1 or 2 person international offices and feeling like, I've got to figure out how to communicate with, both these external audiences and be more effective in my communications with internal audiences. And I think for better or worse, COVID really has underscored that imperative.
That is so true. And I feel like we cannot not have this conversation without talking about the elephant in the room, which is COVID. So much of our work has been dictated by, supporting the different, like you said, external and internal. So, what were some of the early impacts, I would say, you noticed, or what were some of the early impacts that you had to work towards? And Laura, if I can just also talk about, Duke has a campus in China, and did you notice anything about, I mean, you probably heard about the pandemic much earlier than, or were preparing for it in a different way in China. And did you incorporate any of those then at your campus at Duke?
Yes, so we do have a campus in China, Duke Kunshan University, which is near Shanghai. And for us, as all of us were beginning to hear about this emerging situation in China, we, our colleagues on the ground in China were, already in it and dealing with the response in China. So for us, it really began in early to mid-January of 2020. And, looking back on it, you can see that we kind of things that we did to support our colleagues at Duke Kunshan, we then 2 months later were doing on a much bigger scale at Duke. And some of those things were even thinking about their messaging to all of their constituents and, reaching students and parents all over the world, all at the same time. Many of them, I believe when the travel restrictions hit in China was right at the Lunar New Year. So many students and faculty had left to go wherever they were going for the Lunar New Year holiday, and then were in place there. So we were trying to reach people around the world and connect with them. And our colleagues at Duke were working to support the university operationally as well in China. So we have a great learning innovation team at Duke, and they immediately jumped in to help Duke Kunshan put all of their courses online quickly. And we were communicating about that, writing stories about that, pitching stories about how this university is going online, in kind of an overnight fashion. And maybe we should have realized that we'd be doing the same thing again a couple of months later, but it definitely was a learning experience. And then as we transitioned into communicating about Duke's operations, we had learned a lot of lessons. But we also, some of the things like talking about the institutional story were, we were just moving into an operational mode where we then weren't doing the writing about how we're getting the classes online. It was more of, as everyone I'm sure who's here in the huddle is doing, how to get to your classes online and how to do this and how to teach your classes, much more of an operational crisis mode.
Yes. I remember we pivoted from doing a Lunar New Year greeting that we sent to our, Chinese community, both in the US and in China. And instead of doing that, we ended up doing a message of support because it was around the same time that we were seeing this just go, so we wanted to engage with them, not knowing 2 months later we would be doing, like they would be supporting us and sending us masks and telling us, we are with you. So it was definitely, quite the change, I would say. What about Karin? What kind of stories were you seeing early on in the, or what were you writing about early on in the pandemic?
Well, like Laura, the international beat, it was kind of, the early warning sort of system. And so for quite a while, probably, as Laura said, probably for about 2 months, from early January till early March, I was the only reporter at the Chronicle writing about the pandemic. It was very much an international story. So I was writing about, places like DKU trying to pivot. And I remember talking to students who had not been able to go home for the Lunar New Year and how they were, suddenly alone on the, at this campus and supporting one another. Obviously, then it pivoted as, the virus spread. It became much more of a study abroad story, as it came, the pandemic came to Europe. Clearly, that's the largest destination for international students. I think that was a particularly confusing time and a particularly big communications challenge. I heard at that point quite often from parents who were turning to me for advice or for information because, I think a lot of study abroad programs had naturally been communicating with their students. And newsflash, 20-year-olds don't always tell their parents what's up. And so these parents were seeing my articles about study abroad and being like, what's going on with my program? What are they going to do with my kids? And so I think it was the time of, really fast changing, and really, as Laura said, sort of how, how everybody was shifting what they were talking about. And honestly, at the beginning of even as the pandemic started to come here, I was still the reporter because, suddenly I was like the coronavirus beat reporter. And so I was writing about how were colleges beginning to think about the possible risks. And I very much remember writing a story probably late February, early March about how health center directors were beginning to think about, the possibilities of COVID-19 happening in America and drawing on their experience from SARS and the bird flu. And, to the extent that even though we were all watching everything that had happened first in Asia, in China, and then in Europe, there still seemed to be kind of this, like, it's not going to happen here. We're not going to have to deal with it in the same way. I can remember fairly high up in my story writing about one health center director raising the possibility of closing campus for maybe a week, she said, to deal with COVID. And my editor really pushing back and saying, should we include that? That seems really alarmist. And I said, well, this is a person who's been through all these pandemics. She's kind of an expert. We should keep it in. And probably 2 weeks later, every college in the US was closed. So I think it was an incredibly fast moving story at the time.
Rebecca, do you want to add something?
I think that for us, and again, talking about media specifically, there were some challenges initially because of, I think the leadership and just the university just very quickly started being very much focused inward. And so media, sometimes it's already the first thing to go. And if you think about international media within that framework, it's probably even more so. And rightly so, there were a lot of questions about what to do, decision making, what to do in the fall, whether to close or not. And I think that kind of an inward focus had initially, took a toll also on our media outreach, especially about the institution. But I think that also, 20% or so of our student population is international. And so there were, at the same time, obviously very quickly changing decision-making and very quickly changing scenarios. We had a lot of interest from international media about a range of issues to do with our international community, from, how would students get home, or, when we started the study abroad programs, how they were working, what university we were partnering with. And there was a lot of interest. And I think that because the situation changed very rapidly, it was also up to us to stay very, very connected with our international offices internally to understand, what kind of information we could share and when, because we didn't want to give an information, also publication times, when is this story going to be published? I don't want to give you information today that may be, expanded with some more next week. So there was a lot of that. And I think that was part of the initial challenge. Maybe we'll talk a little bit also of sort of some of the lessons and
yeah, no, that's a really good point. I remember, in this fast moving times, how to communicate some of those decisions to the audiences, I think became very critical. Suddenly there were international students with the borders closed who couldn't go back to their country. So can they stay on campus? Where will they stay? All of those kinds of decisions became really important to communicate. And I believe, and I think at that time we made the decision to say, okay, we will give consistent communication, and sometimes to the point of over communicating some of that information with them, so they felt not anxious, because I remember anxiety was super high, not just among, I would say, students, but also among administrators, because it was something that people had not really done before, right? It was a completely unprecedented situation. So just moving a little bit away from the students to just talking about doing some of the external media relations. But before I ask the question, I wanted to ask our attendees, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put it in the chat box, and we can talk about your questions as well as they come in. But I just wanted to move away a little bit from our talking about international students to then saying research about some of this was also pretty critical at the early times. Like, how does this spread? How do you pitch experts about some of this? So I wanted to talk about, how were you differentiating, first of all, between research news and institutional news to a global audience? And where were some of the challenges or opportunities that you saw?
Thank you, Mandira. This goes back a little bit to sort of the pre-pandemic sort of strategy that we had, where it was very important for us to have someone in our office that was the specialist on international media. And that was very important for different reasons, because it really was the person who was feeding information and knowledge about these outlets and contexts to the rest of the team. So that if we were pitching, a piece on climate change, if we were pitching a piece of research about sort of agriculture, these team members would have the benefit of the knowledge of these other contexts, of this corner of the world. And then in itself, it took years, and it's always a work in progress. But having that sort of expertise in our world when the pandemic hit, I think it was very, very helpful. As I said, we received a tremendous amount of inward requests from international outlets about the institution, about what was going to happen to students, faculty, research, a range of questions. And what that meant, really, this is, service requests for us are a wonderful way to build contacts and relationship with reporters. And so one of the things that happened pretty quickly initially was that we were able to discern among, sort of that big number, the context that we really needed to shift also to our pitching, like outreach about research and about experts. And that was a really good way for us to sort of take the kind of those contacts and develop the relationship with them. And we may not have had them before, or they may not have been interested necessarily in Cornell before the pandemic. So that was a really interesting thing that happened pretty quickly, and having someone in-house that could really give a sense of worth for all of these outlets and contexts was key. The research part and the experts, sort of pitching experts about what was going on, the science of COVID, the, public health protocols. That was something that we noticed early on, but also broader, just media relations generally. At Cornell, we really focus on pitching experts on current events, on whatever's happening in the news. And obviously, COVID was a shift. I think like the vast majority of reporters really shifted their beats and started covering whatever they were covering before. They had to pivot. And so as a sort of a group in pitching experts, we quickly understood that that's what we needed to do as well. What that meant is that, we were pretty much on current events. We were pitching only on COVID, and that's true for national, but it was also true for international, leveraging and taking advantage of these inbound requests that we were getting. And yeah, in terms of the institution, I think that, again, initially, leadership was very much focused on sort of getting the message to its own audiences. So the people that needed it most and the people that needed it fast. So faculty, staff, students. But I believe that once they, once we had a plan for the fall, and once Cornell also did a work in understanding how the virus would spread on campus if the entire population of students was invited back, and found that with rigorous testing, the virus could be contained better than leaving students in their hometowns and not bringing them back to campus. Once all of this kind of took its course and decisions were made, I think that leadership was also more willing to engage with media. And we've had, nationally, obviously, but I think the sort of Cornell model of testing very frequently, and as well as creating a lab on campus where they were processing those tests, that was a very sort of, we got a lot of inbound requests on that, and we got interest from Japan, we got interest from outlets in Canada, we got a lot of international interest. And we were able to sort of really service those requests and tell the story, in part, I think, because everybody was a lot more comfortable with the decision making, and also with, at the beginning of the pandemic, I think saying I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow is a little bit scary, generally for anybody. And very quickly, I think everybody realized that that's exactly what you have to say, whether it's to internal audiences or to external audiences, because it is the truth. And so I think everybody got more comfortable with that type of message as well.
So what you're saying is being flexible was really, really important to both internal and external audiences, and being able to build on that, right? Build on that flexibility and trust. I think that needed to be created among internal and external audiences, and then build on that with research and, decisions, say how to do, based on public health. Karin and Laura, what were some of the things that you see as challenges or opportunities from this period?
Well, I'll share one opportunity that we found that I think for our team has been one of the silver linings of this whole experience is, like Rebecca said, we're always looking for opportunities to pitch Duke experts, and especially to demonstrate the value of the type of research and scholarship that our faculty members are doing. And when the pandemic began, we started doing virtual media briefings. So using Zoom webinars just like this to bring a selection of our faculty members together and make them available to media. And initially it was around the science and the infectious disease perspective, the public health considerations, but we pretty quickly started looking at themes that we thought would be emerging for reporters and others. So we had experts on panic. So we had a literature expert on panic, and brought together someone on financial markets related to panic, and did a session on that. We had around the time of the conversation regarding religious services in the spring, we had a panel of our religious leaders and our divinity dean talking about how religious communities were responding to this. So we've done over the past year, I think we're now at 61 virtual media briefings that we've done, and they've kind of grown. The original intent was media, but we started streaming them live on YouTube. So anyone can tune in and listen and hear from our experts. And for our team, it's been a real win in terms of being able to continue to demonstrate the value of scholarship throughout the pandemic, we were aided by the fact that, in the beginning, everyone was home, right? Most of our faculty were more available than they would have been had they been traveling and doing kind of their normal daily activities. But it really allowed us to think about how we do our work in different ways. My colleague Greg Phillips, who's on today, he does a lot of our global communications work, and he pivoted to being our host. So he hosts all of these media briefings. He's planned most of them, and the whole team has just jumped in and done their work in different ways. And it gave us a nice way of organizing our work as communicators, but also ways to develop new faculty relationships even within Duke, and to continue our ongoing engagement with media and others.
And I would say, we ended up using the same technology, but for internal audiences. So building that kind of live town halls for faculty, as everybody was trying to figure out what does this situation look like? What does this fall look like? And especially after executive orders over the summer, there was a lot of anxiety around, will I be able to come back for fall? So we used the same technology, but then to build these kinds of live town hall models that we did with international students and faculty to talk about their concerns. And like I said, when we were communicating with them, we even we even shared things that the university was filing to the government in those links, because we said, okay, let's just try to be open and share as much information as we can to say we support you. And on that note, I want to ask a question that Jeffrey Mark has asked. And Karin, I think I want you to start with this, but he's asking, do you believe the growth of international students on American campuses is going to continue, or do you think has the attraction of the US education peaked?
Oh gosh. Actually, we're about to come out with a big collaboration between the Chronicle and American Public Media, a whole article, big feature, and a documentary and podcast, hour-long on that question. So, but to address it in a couple of minutes. So I think in the short term, there is some reason for optimism. And if we had been talking even a couple of months ago, I might not have said that. But I do think that the government has been more committed to trying to get visas, to prioritize students in the visa processing. There have been some hiccups. Obviously, the pandemic is not in the past tense, and we've seen consulates around the world open and start visa processing only to close. But I think that there is a good faith effort and a lot of reason to think that many of these students will come. I mean, there's obviously some complications. It's expensive, and people are raising airfares internationally and domestically. And then there's a lot of confusion around vaccines. But overall, I think there's a lot of pent-up demand, and so reason to think students will come. I think the longer term questions are in some ways exacerbated by the pandemic. But there's also a lot of longer term issues that are challenging for enrollments. And I do think it's important to remember too that, well, we all got used to this new normal of every year international students growing by double digit percentages, and that's probably not sustainable. And so, will we see more competition from other places? Will the pandemic usher in new ways of educating people? Will you see more places like Duke and Sean that are bringing an American education to overseas rather than, assuming that students are going to come here? Are we going to see, a growing comfort level with online education? And does that open up new pathways for international education? So, there are just so many unknowns, so many questions, but also in many ways, so many opportunities right now. And I think it's a pivotal point. And so check back in another year or two, maybe I'll have a clearer answer for you on that.
Laura, Rebecca, are you seeing any change in the last couple of years, or especially after the pandemic? Or do you want to comment on Jeffrey's question?
It's hard. I think Karin made a lot of great points just about the disruptions, recent disruptions, and some longer term considerations. I do think that the sort of online education and the way so many institutions have pivoted in that space is a big factor as well. But I think that, you know, Karin would know best. I think that she's, yeah.
Well, in that case, Karin, I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe we can stay in this topic for another minute and say, you know, if you could give us some sense of how education reporting has changed for you in the last 15 months, I think that'll be really insightful for all of us to hear.
Sure. I mean, in some ways, in the very practical, you know, I was, you know, on a beat that I was traveling a lot, whether domestically or internationally, and suddenly everything has to happen this way through Zoom. And initially I was really worried about that. I mean, you know, in the grand scheme of things in the pandemic, wasn't my biggest concern, but, you know, would that really damage the kind of insight that you get when you go to a place and, you know, are sitting across the table from, you know, families, you know, from China or India? You know, no, I don't think anything replicates that, but, you know, it's also, there've been opportunities. You know, I did a story with students who have been, you know, stuck back home overseas, taking their classes online. And we were able, you know, I was able to go into their bedrooms with them as they were taking classes through the magic of Zoom, you know, at 3 a.m. and really kind of see what that was really like for them to be in this kind of way. I also think, and you know, Rebecca had kind of gotten at this a little bit with I think for all higher education reporters, there's been a shift in the way that our reporting has been seen, because colleges have become, both here in the US, but also globally, so much assumed different roles in this story of COVID. So there's been, you know, reporting on the colleges themselves and how they responded, because clearly, you know, a college campus is a sort of concrete place that's, you know, gonna have to be responding in a sophisticated way to this pandemic. In some ways, I would say that the colleges were kind of like uniquely positioned, because they are so global, to be kind of on the front lines of this and to be sort of the kind of first responders in a way. But also in the ways that Rebecca had talked about with research. I mean, I think, you know, there's been so much more attention paid to the ways that colleges and their global connections can help be the places that hopefully solve this problem. I mean, I for this podcast I mentioned, I talked with Michael Osterholm, who's the epidemiologist that you've probably seen on CNN and everywhere, at the University of Minnesota. And he made this point to me. He said, you know, I don't think if I didn't have this kind of basis for doing research and having all these global connections, which is what higher education does, we would be so far behind in responding to this. And he said, this isn't the kind of thing you can do on the fly in the middle of a crisis. It's the way that higher education has kind of nurtured these connections over time and been this way that we build sort of global relationships. And he said, that's how, you know, we got to the variants and we got to the vaccines quite nearly as quickly as we did.
Absolutely. You know, but again, you know, I think that I'll use this moment to sort of shift again, like we did from internal to external communication. You know, the last 15 months have been a period which has been dominated by crisis communication in some way, you know, whether you're responding externally or internally. But, you know, given fall, you know, most of the universities are now making a transition back to in-person education. What are some of the priorities, especially in the next year in terms of global education, global communication, Laura and Rebecca, but Corinne, in terms of reporting stories, I would say that's how I would pose it to you. But I just wanted to spend some time thinking about that as well.
Well, related to Jeffrey's question and the idea of, will we see this continued interest in study in the US? One thing that I think, I've become much more cognizant of and concerned about is this idea of, in 5 years ago, of course, we just assumed people wanted to come to the US to study. And I think now it's much more incumbent upon the universities to demonstrate the value of that opportunity, and also to help reassure students and parents that this is a welcoming place, that we do value and appreciate international students, and we understand what they bring to our communities. And we've been working more closely with our government relations colleagues as they've been working to respond to different policy actions. We've been working with them to both to support their work, but to make sure that our work is in alignment with theirs. And that's the kind of thing that a few years ago we weren't necessarily doing as closely, at least related to global topics.
I think you just answered my next question as well. Karin or Rebecca, anybody want to go next?
I think that's been true for in our world, sort of more coordination. The thing that I mentioned at the beginning, I sit in Central, and part of Central is also the office, our Vice Provost for International Affairs. And I don't think that we were communicating with them quite as much, even though I had the international media beat. So I was working with them to a degree, but I think that it's been just exponential. But I also think that sort of on the research and science side, yes, it's true that, university will continue to demonstrate their value as institutions for prospective students, for example. But I think that on the research side, sort of the value of research and the value of our faculty, the pandemic has had maybe the opposite effect of just showing it so clearly, just a tremendous interest in science that has grown in the last 2 years, has really showed that, reporters who were not really in that beat, they shifted to it very quickly. They got an education about the basics of science, and everybody. And so much of it was done with, I think, the expertise that comes from universities. And so in a way, that's a very hopeful story where the value is just there. And it's on the newspapers every day when you read front page, not relegated to sort of the science pages. And so in that respect, I think that that's a very positive development of interest and engagement. Yeah.
I mean, quickly on my beat, the question that Jeffrey raised is probably the single biggest one that I will be continuing to try to figure out. We talk obviously about the great value that international students bring because of the diversity, but it's also the case that they're an important revenue driver. And that's gonna, as we kind of emerge into this precarious post-COVID budgetary picture, what could that mean for colleges if they don't have that? On the study abroad front, obviously, I think we're really going to be watching to see if students are Americans and their families want to still go overseas, where they go. What does global engagement look like? Do we see kind of this different ways that colleges begin to have partnerships and not just educate students, but do research? Is there, is this, as Rebecca suggested, does this kind of spur actually more collaboration? At the same time, Laura mentioned government affairs. I think there's some reason for optimism under the new administration that it's going to be more friendly towards global engagement, but this has been a time, obviously, where there's been a lot of political complications. And so will those continue? And then just lastly, one of the things that I'm really interested in, and I feel like I should say this, you all are from, large institutions with long histories of being deeply globally engaged. What happens to those small institutions? are they able to, does this continue to be a commitment they can make? Will they still appeal to international students? Will we have kind of a world of have and have nots when it comes to international education and internationalization? So that's a big sort of theme I think I'll continue to keep an eye on.
And that's a great point, Karin. I feel like, at least at UVA, I think we are going to see some of the things that have been built in the last 15 months. I don't think they'll all completely go away. I think there will be some element of virtual engagement available, and definitely for students or faculty, or and it'll continue to build those relationships, and especially for students who don't want to go abroad for a global virtual internship. The fact that there are virtual global internships available with an NGO in Nigeria, I think that is going to continue. I somehow don't think that's going to go away, having been in place for almost now 2 summers. Similarly, I think some of the partnerships that we've built, especially with student councils, especially as we were navigating this pandemic, I feel like we will definitely want to continue down that road, knowing that they can be good partners for us, especially when there are these executive communications that are coming out from higher leadership. And lastly, I would say some of that in person, we are hoping to start, not talk about just COVID, but also global research on a wider scale. And I think as faculty are moving towards, starting to think about what their global research looks like, I'm hoping we'll see a wider variety of some of that as well come out as we make this transition to fall in the next year. But I wanted to end on this, something that I think we've touched on, but I want to very specifically ask this question: that why does international education still remain relevant despite all the challenges that we've talked about? And there have been challenges in the last 15 months. So if I could just hear from you, I know we have the last 10 minutes, but it would be great if we can all just sort of touch upon it quickly.
I can say a few words. I mean, it's so why it should be relevant, or how it should remain relevant. On a very general basis, I just think I cannot think of a future where exchange and global communication and just global exchange and people moving it, that doesn't happen. I cannot, sort of, especially in the area of education, I can't think of a time when, a kid in Italy will not be thinking, I want to study this subject and I want to go somewhere that's not my home to study that subject. It's very hard for me to think of that. And I think that the issue for me, or for us, is internally and within a university, is to continue to demonstrate the value of what we do to leadership, the university leadership. So it's not really, how we keep international education, relevant. It's more, how do we explain the value of communicating that relevance internally, so that it doesn't, fall in the priorities of the many things that we are communicating out. And I think that demonstrating value in my world is really, this last year, year and a half, has demonstrated value. The kind of coverage that Cornell's experts have gotten, the kind of coverage that the university has gotten internationally, that is really shows how, and the audience for these outlets, and the amount of responses that we've gotten from people that have seen this coverage. I think that in itself is a wonderful way to demonstrate the value of communicating.
That's a great answer. Showing how this is not so much as why education is international education is relevant, but showing the value of why this is relevant, I think is going to be important. Karin or Laura, any last words?
I mean, I would say, just building on that, I think there's very much the challenge of global to local. I mean, if you're in, the world of international education, I would say most people who do that believe in it and as a good for in and of itself. And I think one of the things, and at the very last conference I was at before the pandemic, this was something people were talking about. And so I think in some ways the pandemic may be help answer this question, but I think that there was a real challenge that people were finding about not how just, I think Rebecca makes a very good point about how to demonstrate value to an internal audience, but also that external audience. How do you make it clear to the people in your community that having international students here matters, that doing global research matters? It can seem very big and unwieldy and hard to get your arms around if you are, a community member. And how do you do that? I think you mentioned, Mandira, earlier the legal action over the last summer. And I think one of the things that people found a little bit heartening then was that in the case which was dealing with international students and whether or not they could continue to take classes online, that a bunch of cities and counties filed in support of colleges. And so did that sort of suggest here's some places that actually are maybe getting this and that their communication's working. So I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge.
So you are right. I mean, I think our institution filed, and then, but the state of Virginia ended up filing too. So our letter just got added into that as well. So yeah, it was quite the time. But that's a great point. Laura?
Kind of as a closing thought, in answer to your question is, if we take anything away from the pandemic, I would think it's a greater understanding of how connected we all are, and that, you may have borders, but we are really all going to experience things, in interconnected and borderless ways. And the role that global education, global research, scientific collaboration have in that, I would hope it becomes more clear than ever just how important that is for not just education, but for society as a whole.
Yes, and on those great points, I just want to end on that note saying, in that, there is so much we've learned in the last 15 months on how to communicate both externally and internally to a global audience. And I'm sure we'll take some of these lessons as we go forward. But I think everyone on this call has sort of demonstrated, the importance and the of global communications. So on that note, I wanted to end this, and thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope all of this was helpful and useful as you think through the next year. And back to you, Greg. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Karin.
Thank you all, and thank you, Mandira. What a fascinating and conversation full of so much insight and the value of the experiences that we've all had that have been very, very difficult, without a doubt. And everything that you all are doing to deal with it and to rise above it is not only very informative, but quite honestly inspirational. And I thank you all very, very much.